Okay, so now let's look at the Keynesian Cross model in graphical form. So here we have the expenditure line for our model. And we can see that we've got on the vertical axis, we've got total expenditure. On the horizontal axis, we've got real GDP, which we're representing with the letter Y. And as you can see there, what we're showing is that given some autonomous level of expenditure, remember expenditure is made up of C plus I plus G plus NX. This is the total expenditure. We can see there, after some given level of total expenditure, independent of income, that as income rises, expenditure rises. That's chiefly because with an increase in income of these variables, these components of expenditure, there's an increase in consumption expenditure. But remember, it's not a one-to-one relationship, because some of that income will go to savings, some will go to taxation, and some will be spent on imports. So it might be, for example, that income increases by, say, 200. It will lead to an increase in consumption, not of 200, but of 120. In fact, that's what we can see on the graph here. We move up the graph, up the expenditure line. We've increased income by 200, and we've increased expenditure by 120. Okay? We've gone from 200 to 320, and that's constant. So we move up another increase of 200 would lead to another increase in expenditure by another 120, and so on. All right. Now, we remember that we were going to say that the economy will tend towards equilibrium, and equilibrium was where income equaled expenditure. So our question is, well, where is that? Where is equilibrium on this line? Where does income equal expenditure? Well, if you look, you can find it. If you look carefully, you can find the point at which income equals expenditure. Income equals expenditure at this point here. You can see there, 500 equals 500. This is our equilibrium point. Now, rather than just doing an eyeball test to find it, we have another tricky way of doing that. If we draw a line showing all the possible equilibrium points, then we can easily find where the equilibrium will actually be. So a possible equilibrium point is where 100 equals 100, where 200 expenditure equals 200 income, where 300 expenditure equals 300 income, and so on. So let's draw a dotted line showing all the possible equilibrium points, and then we can easily find where the equilibrium will be, because these are all possible equilibrium points. Where's the actual equilibrium? Well, here's our actual expenditure line. So the actual expenditure line cuts the equilibrium line at this point here, 500 equals 500. So it's an easy way to find equilibrium. Okay, the diagram can show us, in a way, the tendency towards equilibrium as well. Let's say the economy were in disequilibrium. Let's say we're in a situation where expenditure was greater than income. Here we can see expenditure is greater than income. Income is 200, expenditure is 320. In that case, since expenditure is greater than income, or expressed in a different way, the aggregate demand for goods and services is greater than the production of goods and services. This encourages firms to increase production. They increase production, incomes increase, and as incomes increase, we know that expenditure will increase. We'll move further along the expenditure line. But we can still see, it's still the case in that situation, that expenditure is still greater than income. Not as much as before, but it's still greater, which encourages further increases in production. Higher incomes, higher expenditure. But again, we can still see that expenditure is greater than income, so firms increase production again, incomes rise, expenditure rises in reaction until we get to this point here where the total expenditure equals total production, income, and there's no incentive on the part of firms to increase production any further than that. What if, on the other hand, we had a situation where expenditure were less than income? Or in other words, a situation where total production was greater than the expenditure on the goods and services produced, such as this situation. Here we can see expenditure is 720, income is 900. In that case, firms realize that they've overproduced, their inventories are filling up with excess stock which is unsold, so they realize we've got to cut production. They decrease production, incomes fall. As incomes fall, expenditure falls. But it's still the case in this situation that expenditure is less than income, production generated. Firms realize they've got to cut back production further. Production falls, incomes fall, and therefore expenditure falls. Until we get to this point here where the total expenditure equals the income. So we're back to equilibrium. So we have this, we're representing this tendency towards equilibrium. So far so good. Here's the, what we might call, radical implication of this model. Keynes argued that an economy could become temporarily stuck at an equilibrium level that was below full employment. That is, the economy could come to settle at an equilibrium which generated mass unemployment, and that in the short run there was nothing in the economy which would rectify this problem quickly. So the economy could generate demand-deficient unemployment, which is also, in your textbook, is called cyclical unemployment, because it's referring to the business cycle. When an economy goes into recession, the downward portion of a business cycle. So, but Keynes's point is that you could have unemployment that's generated by insufficient demand for goods and services in the economy, and that in the short run there was no reason to think that the economy in itself would rectify that problem. So graphically we can represent it in this way. Here we are at equilibrium, but let's say that the level of output which would generate full employment, which would eliminate any cyclical unemployment, is at 900. So you can see at this point that expenditure at full employment, expenditure would be less than output. And if we said the economy were actually, for some reason, at full employment initially, this is a disequilibrium level of output. And there will be, as per just discussed a little while ago, a tendency for firms to decrease production. As a result, expenditure will fall until we reach the actual equilibrium point, where income equals expenditure. But in the meantime, it will have generated unemployment. If this was full employment, and the economy naturally tends back to a level of output below full employment, it means that cyclical or demand deficient unemployment will have been created by the economy. By the way, this doesn't mean if the economy were at full employment, it doesn't mean there's no unemployment. It just means there's no cyclical unemployment. Full employment doesn't mean no one at all is left without a job. It means that there are people who are unemployed, but they're unemployed for different reasons. They could be unemployed because they're looking for a better job, and while they're looking for a better job, it takes time to find a better job, so there's friction in moving from one job to another. We call that frictional unemployment. And it could also be the case that people are unemployed because they don't have the appropriate skills. The skills that they possess are not demanded by firms in the economy. So we say that they are people, in that case, are structurally unemployed. So at full employment, you can still have frictional and structural unemployment. But what we're talking about here is when the economy naturally tends to a level of GDP below full employment, creating additional unemployment on top of that, what we're calling cyclical or demand deficient unemployment. That is, unemployment that arises not because someone's looking around for a better job and not because they're unskilled or don't have the appropriate skills, but they don't have a job because there aren't jobs available. Anyway, assuming that the economy were at its actual equilibrium, there are two gaps which we've got labels for. One is the gap between expenditure and output or income. And we call this gap the recessionary gap, where expenditure is less than income. And the gap between full employment and the full employment GDP and the actual GDP level, the equilibrium GDP level, is indicated by excess capacity, and it's called sometimes the output gap. Now, there's another implication that we can draw from this model, and that is that it's possible for the economy could have a level, be operating at an equilibrium level of GDP that is beyond the full employment equilibrium level in the short run. And in that case, the economy will naturally tend to generate inflation. GDP will be, or incomes will be increasing, not so much because of increased production, but because of higher prices. And we can represent this idea in the following way. So here's our economy at equilibrium. Let's say, just for fun, that the full employment level of GDP is at 100. In that case, we can say that the equilibrium, that the economy, if it were at full employment in this situation, this is a disequilibrium, full employment level, and the economy will tend towards the equilibrium. It will tend to increase income, and therefore expenditure will tend to increase towards the equilibrium. But in doing so, will generate inflation. So again, here's one of the gaps. We call this gap between expenditure, which is higher than income, an inflationary gap, because the economy will tend towards full employment. It will tend towards the equilibrium, and it will tend to push prices up, create inflation. And we can say that the gap between the full employment GDP and the equilibrium GDP indicates that the economy is operating above capacity. And we would call this a negative output gap.